Hey there. Although I am involved with CADAC, the Center of ADHD Awareness Canada, the views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the participants and do not reflect those of CADAC. And now, cue the music.
This is the Impulsive Thinker Podcast, a show for high-achieving ADHD entrepreneurs. Together, we will inform and educate you about how to improve your self-awareness while developing systems, routines, and habits for conquering the entrepreneurial world. Here is your host, André Brisson.
Hey there, it's André with another short for the Impulsive Thinker Podcast, the podcast for the high-achieving ADHD entrepreneur. This episode is brought to you by CADAC, the Center of ADHD Awareness Canada. You can get more information about CADAC at www.caddac.ca. Today I want to talk about something that happened a little bit while ago, and I was listening to a podcast, and this podcast is people I know. People I've had many conversations about my diagnosis, the ADHD brain and whatnot. And on the podcast, it was mentioned that it was amazing how my brain worked, because it worked opposite of everyone. Because of my ADHD, every time I am challenged, I get immediately angry. And that's and the point was that it's an ADHD thing, and it's just amazing how I was able to not manipulate, but be able to handle that and to still be successful. Well, we all know that I was completely wrong. Immediate reaction was, what the hell? How can he misunderstand our conversations? How can he blah, blah, blah? That's where my brain went. Then I said, hey, slow down, buddy. Stop. My old me would have been I would have just kept going on that negative track, that negative loop, but with all my awareness and now that I know, I actually stopped myself. I said, stop. Let's just wait a minute. Was he intentionally misunderstanding the information to do something negative? Was he intentionally making accusations without the knowledge? Was he just basically making accusations just to make me look bad? Still all negative, right? But then I said, what if he misunderstood the conversation in general? His recollection of the conversation, because we talked about a lot of different things, complex things. Maybe his recollection of the conversation was not 100%, and he got things mixed up. And hey, wait a minute, that's a valid point. So I started thinking about it. I took apart that conversation, the statements that were made, and it was 4 different conversations that he stitched together, either consciously, subconsciously, intentionally, or not. Then I start to look at it, and I said, okay, he misunderstood. The information was kind of cut and paste from all over, and the message was misunderstood and misrepresented. So I decided, what I didn't do in the past, I would just go with this. I listened to it a couple more times, that segment, and I started to notice that, I don't think it was intentional. It was complete misunderstanding. And for me, that was a different place for me to be. How do I deal with this? Usually what I did in the past is ignore it, just have negative thoughts, or just not deal with it, or just say, okay, fine, we'll let it go because I don't have the right or the audacity to correct or speak up on this and advocate for myself and stick up for myself. That was my old self. Or I would just say, crooked bunch of people, they don't care, and I would have just kind of convinced myself that they were not worth the time and really there's no point doing it. So actually, I sat on this for quite a while. I weighed the pros and cons. I weighed how I can deal with this as a middle ground. What could be the effects? Well, I guess that's the pros and cons. And I really thought about it, and actually, something I didn't do often, I still don't do often, but I'm getting better at, is I reached out to some people and asked for advice and thoughts. And I didn't act on anyone's thoughts or advice. I took their advice and considered it and applied it to the facts that I knew and what. So the point of this whole thing is, when people get it wrong, what do you do? When people have misinformation about ADHD or make accusations that are false about ADHDs, what do you do? And in this case, what I ended up doing was I emailed the hosts of that podcast. First of all, it was really cool because they did reference my podcast, this podcast on it, and that they did mention that I'm really pushing on mental health, especially with men and entrepreneurs. So it wasn't all bad. It was just that one little statement that was not true. So how do you correct that? So what I ended up doing was I emailed them, thanking them for the shout out on the podcast, thanking them for asking people to listen, and thanking them for talking about ADHD. And I think that was important because they did spend a lot of time on mental health and brought in ADHD. And then what I further did is, by the way, this statement was made on the podcast, and I believe it was a misunderstanding of the conversation we had. And what I ended up doing was the part about being angry was in reference to a scenario where my ADHD brain, my prefrontal cortex, the filter that usually stops things before we react, is weak. So when I get an intense angry emotion, my brain doesn't have time to check it to see how I'm going to react. It just comes out and it becomes a fight or flight response from the amygdala. That was the basis of the conversation. And then the other part of the conversation was, yes, that when I do come to a challenge, that's actually when my brain fires well and I'm firing on 12 cylinders and I can hyper-focus and get a lot of work done. So I identified the two areas of the conversation that were mixed up and I corrected that for them. And thanked them again for their time and for the opportunity for that. And I offered them to sit down with them again or go on the podcast and to discuss that. And again, I thanked them for speaking about this stuff because it's important to me. So that was the middle road. And the response was good. They appreciate the information. And am I going to go on the podcast? Probably not. Am I going to get anything else more out of this? Probably not. My old self would have been very upset. But now my new self is saying, I corrected and I informed them. And I think this is the whole takeaway here. This is not in reference to the people in the podcast, but this is just a general thing that I've observed with time. You know what? We can't convince people who do not want to learn. But we seem to want to spend a lot of time convincing them otherwise and to educate them. But that's just a complete waste of energy, because if they're not willing to learn and they don't want to see it from a different point of view, why try to convince them another way? It's like one of my old bosses said, you can't outsmart a determined idiot. So if they're determined to be an idiot, what can you say to change it? And then what I ended up doing is, I'm not saying don't try it once or twice. If it's going somewhere, great, continue. If it's not going anywhere, stop. Spend your time and energy on the people, on those who want to learn. That's where we're going to have the greatest effect to spread awareness, to discuss ADHD for people to accept, is to have people who are listening who want to learn. And there's a lot more of those people out there than the determined idiots who don't want to learn, where we're wasting all of our energy. But if we can spread the word, educate the people who want, they'll talk to more people, they'll be made aware. And I got a lot of people saying, now that I'm talking more about this, they're starting to see it all over the place. And they're starting to see how it makes sense and it explains why the people are the way they are. And they're starting to see the good side of them. So I was really proud of myself on this one. I took the middle road. I weighed the pros and cons, and I corrected a misunderstanding. I didn't take it personally or offensively. I went and helped them understand where the miscommunication or the misunderstanding was. You can't outsmart a determined idiot. Let's stop wasting our time and energy on those people, and let's educate those who want to learn and are supportive to you. So thanks again for listening to my ramblings on this, and I would recommend that you share this episode with a few people. And if you can share a comment and a rating, it would be greatly appreciated. If you got any questions for me, please email me at questions@theimpulsivethinker.com. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Impulsive Thinker podcast. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion for the show, please visit theimpulsivethinker.com. The Impulsive Thinker podcast is produced by Tactical Breakthroughs and hosted by André Brisson. Remember, ADHD is only a part of you, not all of you.